the January 12th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format allows the Planning Commission to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. Today, our meeting will begin with public comment, followed by a work session on the Middle Housing Code amendments. There are several housekeeping announcements and instructions related to the meeting format that I need to take care of first. Thank you for your patience while I work my way through them. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by following the access instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't already done so, please raise your virtual hand now to join the speaker's queue in one of two ways. For those of you viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or other device, click once on this says blue hand icon, but I can see mine has changed colors with a new version. So on the hand icon of some color. For those listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. When the public comment begins, our meeting moderator will announce the next two speakers at a time. When it's your turn, the moderator will announce your name and unmute your microphone. Public comment is limited to 10 minutes, so your time to speak will be based on the number of people signed up to speak. Finally, I want to thank everyone again for their patience, flexibility, and good humor as we work through within this new virtual meeting format. As always, feel free to contact our staff if there is testimony you were not able to provide or wish to get to us in a different manner. With that, I will move on to public comment. And I don't know if we have, I see someone here.
At this time, Commissioner, we have Carlene Riley. She's the only one that's
terrific. Okay, well, Carlene, I'm going to read this a little bit and then we'll let you have at it. Public comment is an opportunity for individuals to speak to the Planning Commission on any topics except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. The Planning Commission reserves 10 minutes at the beginning of the meeting for public comment. Generally, the time limit for public comment is 3 minutes, and it would be nice if you could keep somewhere near that limit. And as a reminder, your hand must be raised, which I believe yours is. When it's your turn, which it is. Okay, staff will let you know when your time is up. Okay, so therefore, I think I have gotten through this entire script, or at least the part that is meaningful at this moment. So with that, Carlene, take it away.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Carlene Riley, and I live at 395 Marion Lane in the River Road neighborhood. I presented some of this testimony at the Metropolitan Policy Committee meeting because I believe transportation and land use need to be integrated with one another, and the topic lent itself to being spoken at the Commissioners meeting. I am remembering our former River Road friend and neighbor, Irene Ferguson, who died 2 years ago on January 17th as a pedestrian on a dark and rainy night on Hunsaker in the Santa Clara area. I appreciate Lane County Transportation mounting a comprehensive set of long and short-term safety measures after Irene's death, with some completed and others in progress. The City of Eugene has improvement projects, including safety features at the River Road, Hunsaker, Irving Road intersection. LTD has been open to memorializing Irene in the area of the new Santa Clara Transit Station, which is opening on February 7th. And a press release will be coming out on this very soon. This brings me to the death of Tony Lockhart, a 61-year-old man killed New Year's night on River Road at Maynard. He was hit in front of Echo Apartments, crossing the road to Dairy Mart. When Echo Apartments were proposed, Evergreen Housing promised a signal light if funds remained at the end of the construction. Well, you know the ending to that story. Signal light should not be an add-on when large apartment complexes are proposed, like the upcoming Evergreen Housing project planned for Lower River Road at Lombard Avenue. Safety features need to be an integral part of a proposal. When a traffic death occurs, everyone rallies round to install safety measures. It's like fighting the last war. It's predictable that a 192-unit apartment would create additional vehicle and pedestrian activity. Why wait until a tragedy to put in signal lights? It would be cheaper to prevent a crash with good safety measures and would certainly save lives and emotional anguish for families and community. After I presented this to the MPC, Councillor Randy Groves spoke of his knowledge of how these tragedies affect people in the community. He was very supportive of my suggestions. And also, Mayor Lucy Bennis agreed with vigor with what Randy Groves was saying. I think this is a land use issue in addition to being a transportation issue, and I think the onus needs to be on the developers, and the city needs to work with them to make sure that they are good safety measures. Thank you for your attention.
Carlene, thank you for taking the time this evening to join our meeting and raise this terrifically important issue. Safety, of course, is primary in everyone's lives, and finding ways to combine that safety issues with land use planning is already done in the code to some degree, but I'm sure we can bring a sharper focus to it if needed. I see Commissioner Isaacson's hand is up. Yes, Commissioner Isaacson.
I just want to thank Carlene for coming and speaking about it. I will tell you that I heard the accident happen. It happened 40 feet outside my house. I've, at this point, had a conversation with the city. I've had a conversation with transportation, the management for Echo, the 3 people who were working at Dairy Mart that night who also heard and saw, who knew the man. I also know that this body does not take care of, or it's not falls under jurisdiction for as it relates to whether or not to install traffic lights going forward. What I will say is that there is an additional apartment complex going in across the street, and I would love to hear from staff at some point on maybe ways we can adjust the code when we're talking about development on a busy road such as River Road to add on the pedestrian component to the mix, from it being a recommendation to a part of the code for permanent status. So that's what I would recommend. I would tell you that everyone around here is constantly talking about it. I walk my son up and down River Road all the time, and it's not an area that I would ever let him go by himself, or frankly too far outside of my reach because of that. So that's my add-on to it.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Isaacson, for sharing that with us. I'm sorry your life was affected directly by this, but I'm glad you're here on the commission to help us track this issue as we go forward. With that, I think we can move on to agenda item B, which is our work session on middle housing code amendments. And for that, I will turn to Terry. And Terry, you're up.
Thank you. We have a number of folks who'll be joining me in presenting today, so I'll have them turn on their cameras when it's their turn to talk, and or now. Hi, Matt. And what we'll do is have each person give their piece of the presentation and then break for questions. And like we did last time, Commissioner Ramey, if you could call on commissioners for questions after each speaker, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Okay. So we're excited today to bring you an update on the Equity Roundtable. There we go. Briefly review the project goals, and then an update rounding out all of the public involvement that we did over the fall. We'll have some guests from the Equity Roundtable, and then we'll go over staff's recommended values and principles. And then we'll hear from our economic analysis consultant, Tyler Bump and Matt Hasty, with an update on the now adopted rules. So as a reminder, our project goals are to comply with the House bill, first and foremost, further ongoing work aimed at addressing equity and affordability, and enable more production of diverse housing types across Eugene. Sorry. Trying to get my mouse in the right place. As a reminder, in 2019, House Bill 2001 was passed by the Oregon legislature to begin to address the deepening housing crisis in the state. The law includes a deadline for implementation by June 30th, 2022. If the city chooses not to adopt our own code by the deadline, the state's model code will apply directly. Under the new law, Oregon cities over 25,000 population are required to allow metal housing types in areas that allow single detached dwellings. Metal housing types are duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. Cities must allow duplexes to be built on each lot. Triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses must be allowed in residential zones that allow detached single dwellings, but not necessarily on every lot or parcel. Rules were adopted by the state in December 2020 that specify what Eugene needs to do to meet minimum compliance standards. The city's zoning must be amended to allow metal housing in all of our residential zones and many of our special area zones. This is a new map, and I realize it's hard for you to see on your screen, but we're going to be putting it on the website, and it's an interactive map that you can zoom in on and take a look at and check out how lot sizes are spread out over the city of Eugene. And that is because many of the minimum standards outlined in the adopted rules are tied to lot size. For example, triplexes must be allowed on lots in the city over 5,000 square feet in size. This map shows lots over 5,000 and under 7,000 in the peach color. So if you look at the zoom in there, this is the Santa Clara area, and you can make out some very pixelated small peach lots. Those are over 5,000 square feet and will be required to allow duplexes. Lots over 7,000 square feet are shown in green. And so all those relate to the standards for quadplexes. So all of the peach and green lots are bigger than 5,000 and so are thus required to allow a triplex. Note that the grayed out lots on this map are not in the city limits, and House Bill 2001 will not apply until property owners annex into the city. As I mentioned, this map will be on our website soon, so people can click around and see what will be allowed where as Eugene implements the new law. And much, much more detail will be coming as we dig into the standards. Here's a refresher on our project phases. We completed phase 1 and are transitioning into phase 2, design and code concept. And this is a new map or a chart that you saw last time without the additions that I'm going to talk about today. I have added anticipated planning commission meetings from now through June. So we're here in January having this meeting. Public outreach I'm sorry, let me just go through the Planning Commission meetings. Your next meeting, which is a newly added work session, will be on February 1st, where we will be doing a deep dive into the minimum standards and rules, as well as going over what is included in the state's model code. So that one we just added and felt like would be a good opportunity to answer all of the meaty questions that everyone has about the rules and the model code that we're still looking into and unable to fully discuss tonight. As far as public outreach, we have a ramp up of public outreach in February with an online survey about the code concepts, meetings in a box, and roundtable and healthy democracy meetings kicking off again in January. Our code products that are funded by our state grant are due from the consultants by the end of June 2021. And then following that, we'll run through a local adoption process that you're familiar with. Final code deadline for adopting Eugene's code is June 30th, 2022. So for the public involvement plan, as you'll recall, the fall outreach focused on asking different groups their hopes, fears, and then what kind of values and principles would be helpful to evaluate forthcoming code drafts. Today, we're going to hear from Equity Roundtable Facilitator Alain Reyes-Santos and Equity Participant Scott. And I'm going to turn it over to them to talk through the Equity Roundtable here. So I think I can advance the slides, Alain, if you're ready to start talking.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to tell you, I have some technical issues. If suddenly if I drop, I'm also on my phone. So I can keep going on my phone if it happens. Been facilitating with my team, Perla Alvarez and Cheyenne Holiday, this Equity Roundtable. And before I proceed, we've met twice in the fall, and the communities and organizations participating are members of the UO Langhouse, Subsequala Teacher Education Program, Disorient Asian American Film Festival, Lane Independent Living Alliance, NWCP, Puerto de la Familia, Chinese American Benevolent Association, and Transponder. And we have both members, community participants of programming in all those different organizations or community groups, and also staff members and board members of some organizations. And so we began our first gathering talking about hopes and fears that people have around allowing middle housing across Eugene. And also then talking about, in the second meeting, thinking about what are some principles and values that people consider will be relevant as middle housing code is created for Eugene. And so before moving into the values and principles, I want to make sure to just share with you some of what people shared in terms of their kind of concerns around expansion of housing in Eugene, middle housing, and what are some of the things that were first in their minds when thinking about hopes and fears. Some things that people talked about was difficulties found in low-income housing and getting on wait list. Thinking about challenges being minorities and finding housing in Eugene, especially if people have one income, don't have good credit. Again, people talking about waiting lists, obstacles finding housing where they could have children and people wouldn't complain about children making regular children noises. We have people talking about not feeling like Eugene was a welcoming place, people of color who are trying to help other people move into town or just find housing in town, and people just feeling like the neighborhoods were not welcoming for them, didn't have welcoming signs, quote unquote. And people also talking about issues around, at times, landlords entering their property trespassing when they were hosting culturally specific activities with family members. In terms of hopes that people had, people talked a lot about NetCo resources being really important for housing in Eugene. And then also talked about some of the things that came up again in our conversation about values and principles, which I will share with all of you right now. So something that was really important for people was thinking about spreading middle housing across Eugene to different areas, thinking about safety and security in building standards and architecture within the code itself. What people meant by this was thinking about that the quality of the buildings themselves were safe, and also was there proper lighting so people don't fall on the stairs and things, so on and so forth. Accessing federal funding for housing dedicated to indigenous communities, native communities. So people talked about how there's actually funding that could be accessed by the city to devote and dedicate housing for native communities in town. Creating housing around and with green spaces was also important for people. One really important key component of our conversation had to do with multifamily and multi-generational opportunities for housing. People talking about how they want to be able to live with their elders who are in their house, along with their grandchildren, how there could be housing that could accommodate those realities. Supporting programs for low-income renters and home buyers and first-time home buyers was also really important for people as well in our conversation. Economic guidance for more people to be able to have access to home buying and home purchasing as well, especially within low-income brackets, and affordability at different income levels. And people were really clear that they wanted to make sure that when we talked about affordability, it wasn't just about middle-class homes, but also thinking about low-income households as well. Next slide, Terry, thank you. People also talked about thinking of opportunities for rent to own, where people pay rent, but that also actually goes into ownership in the future. And they talked about examples of how that has been done in other places in the US, in particular Boston. Distribution amongst different neighborhoods, again, this question of like middle housing throughout different parts of Eugene. Environmentally sustainable housing was also a key value that people shared in our conversation, and specifically connected to the next point around creating relationships with the land in the way that houses are built, housing that are close to rivers and natural resources, to build in conversation with indigenous native communities was really important as well in our conversation, and will come up again in a few other principles as well. Comfortability and safety in neighborhoods, a recognition of bias resistance from neighborhoods to middle housing. So people talked about how they've heard at times neighbors talk about those new people who move into townhomes or duplexes, and like all these bias assumptions about class background or racial background around who are the people who move into neighborhoods, you know, that were not historically part of those neighborhoods before. Applying a decolonizing lens was also a key component of our conversation back in November. Involving local communities, businesses, and contractors to build new housing. People were really invested in thinking about how this could be a way of like the economic sector in Eugene also engaged in the process as well. Next slide, Terry. Another key piece of the conversation in our two meetings actually was about how to prevent and address discriminatory rental practices. So people talking about facing discrimination based on race, migrant status, and also queer LGBTQ people facing discrimination in rental practices, being denied rentals at times, or having difficulty in the process. Also, if the city could think about how to invest in wealthy building programs for low-income households that allow people to then also be able to purchase a home, supporting locals who want to buy houses, incentives for builders to follow the guiding values and principles. Like a big concern that people had is we're going to develop guiding values and principles. Those could be part of the code. What is the incentive for builders to actually follow those guidelines? Another value and principle was around enhancing culture, meaning a culture of belonging for people who have different kinds of cultural practices, also different kinds of households, understandings of family. People were thinking a lot about how there's this idea that you have like 4 people, you know, the nuclear family, 2 parents and 2 kids, but that doesn't really account for the realities for many people that actually live in multi-generational ways. And so that was one of the major concerns. And also people who build family or household with others who are not biologically related to them or family related to them in the ways that are traditionally understood. So that was really important in terms of enhancing a culture of belonging for multiple kinds of households. Democratic and transparent decision-making was really important. People want to have a clear sense of how decision-making will be done around the code and around housing. And co-designing, this is very much related with the applying a decolonizing lens, is co-designing an architecture and floor plans in conversation with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and in particular developing government-to-government relationship with the tribes in such a way that the tribes can be consulted around how things are designed, how are things actually sustainable in this space, and in particular with Kalapuya community members to have them involved in those conversations as well. So those were some of the guiding values and principles that were discussed, and I look forward to any questions in the Q&A.
Thanks, Ellie. I think we'll hear from Scott and then break for questions.
Thanks, Ellie. I mean, that was quite a good recap of what we've been through. So anyways, good evening, commissioners, and thank you for having me at this meeting, and honestly for setting up the equity roundtable. It's really been one of the most positive experiences that I've had in city government. I do want to start by saying I don't represent all people with disabilities. Lila has appointed me to represent, them as a company, and I represent myself, but certainly there's so many aspects of disability that I can't speak for everybody. So I just wanted to put that out there first of all. So I have a couple of random points, and then I'll kind of get into my main stuff. So first of all, when we're considering where to dense up, please don't dense up West Eugene. It would be really unfair to have the low to middle income workers, which COVID honestly showed that that's who makes the city work, to be in the most polluted part of town. So that's something that I really care about deeply, and so does my community. Another one, and I'll circle back to this because I think it's a really important point, but if Eugene could create a community bank for different avenues of mortgage approval, I think that's going to be probably one of the best things we can pull out of this commission and this endeavor. And for reference, and Ali mentioned it, so the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston was able to form a community bank, and it wasn't a rent to own kind of situation. It was more of, they were able to show that they paid their rent for 10 years and therefore were able to qualify for a mortgage, but it wouldn't be through traditional means or traditional banks because their income doesn't qualify. But if they were able to pay their bills for so long, that's how Roxbury was able to be revitalized. So I would really appreciate if you all consider that. And honestly, I'm glad Ali brought up affordable housing because that is super important, especially to the disabled community, but also to our entire community. Quite honestly, the more affordable housing we bring on the market, probably, it's going to bring down prices all around because there's not going to be so much competition for renting out those lower spaces of the middle housing equity. Or the middle housing zoning. So I know that Homes for Good has been making very good strides with affordable housing, but honestly, Lila probably thinks that it needs to be tripled at this point. It's been very hard to place people. And then also Lila has noticed the trend that, I don't know if it's the city or the state or the country, but elderly people and people with disabilities are being kind of lumped into the same group. And that also applies to affordable housing complexes. And that doesn't really work too well because the needs of the populations are very different. So we've had a lot of consumers that have moved into these complexes that are for elderly or disabled people, and specifically people with mental health disabilities. They just don't seem to get along really well there. And most of them have to leave within a year or so. So I would really like to get it in your all's heads to kind of split up elderly and disabled people a bit. So those are kind of my random points, and then I can get into the disability aspect of it. So pulled all these stats from OHSU, and I'm sure they're pretty accurate, but everything changes. So, but 1/4 of all Oregonians with a disability, 1/4 of all Oregonians have some sort of disability. 18.1 percent are in extreme poverty compared to 5.5% in our state with no disability. So that's a 3 times. 32.8% of people with disabilities are employed and are very much deserve the opportunity of home ownership in their community. And 34% are less likely to marry, therefore they will not have a dual income household. And that very much restricts what housing. And this one, the source, depending on the source, the median price in Eugene right now for a house is $275,000 to $330,000. And just for context, I wanted to state, so a person on disability who is just accepting their disability check probably doesn't expect to own a home. But if they go out and get a job, basically where they're coming in at is $18,000 a year, plus including their disability check. And I ran that through Zillow, and the mortgage they could afford is $50,000. And then I plugged in my numbers because I'm about to get off of disability benefits, and I hope to be making $65,000 in 2 or 3 years, and that's very hopeful. But I could still only afford a $240,000 house. That's way below the median. So I very much appreciate that this commission has been put together, and we're finding creative solutions to get to the problem. I'm just trying to show how this is affecting the disabled community, and how accessibility to middle income housing is kind of not accessible to people with disabilities at all right now. So to further that point, the cost of living in Eugene is 6.7% higher than the nation. And that is mostly due to transportation, housing, and food, which are all things that people with disabilities have to afford. And a typical disability check is somewhere between $800 and $1,000 per month. And if you don't have a Section 8 voucher, which is very hard to get, it took me 7 years, you're paying 80% of your income to just straight up. So that's something to consider as well. And then I pulled up the poverty levels too, because that very much applies to the disabled community. So Eugene is coming in at 21.1% poverty versus Oregon. The whole state is at 12.6, so that's almost double. And then when we're talking about extreme poverty, we're talking about 9.9 in Eugene percent versus 5.6 for the state of Oregon. And then when it comes to people with disabilities, the situation gets even more dire. So Eugene ranks in at 18.8% of people in poverty with disabilities, whereas Oregon is at 14.4, and that's for men. I don't know why they split it up that way, but that's how it is. And then, and then for women, Eugene comes in at 22.5% with people with disabilities versus the state average of 18.4. So there's certainly some equity issues there, and some things that we need to consider when we're talking about going forward with housing. So I wanted to circle back to the community bank a bit, and I'm definitely willing to buy the rights to these documentaries to show you. But the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston was able to. They were about to be, totally gentrified, and their community got back together, and they formed a community bank, and they were able to show through, paying your cell phone bills, paying your rent, that kind of stuff. It doesn't matter how rent burdened the person is. If they paid their bills on time, they should be able to qualify for a mortgage. And I would very much like to see, and I think that's totally Eugene's culture to do something along those lines. So that's probably one of my biggest hopes out of this commission. And then another issue is property taxes. Like when you move into home ownership, we're going to be very expensive with property taxes. One of my fellow employees did give me permission to tell you a little bit about her story. So she's very lucky to have more than just her Social Security income. You know, she worked for the state for 15 years, so she has PERS, and you know, she has some other income coming in, but she can barely afford her 800 square foot house. You know, the mortgage is what it is, but she's having to pay $2,500 a year for taxes and $1,500 a year for insurance. And when you're talking about a person with a disability, even if you're talking about someone like Jean, that's got to be at least 25 to 30% of your income. So one thing that I would like to suggest, and I don't know if this commission has the power to do it, but would be to have a sliding scale for housing or housing taxes for the low socioeconomic status brackets. So that was another suggestion. Not a lot. And I'm on my last page. I promise I'm finishing up. Thank you for giving me this time. So closing thoughts. So the community bank would not only allow Eugene residents to buy houses, but it gives the opportunity for upward mobility for people who have not usually been included when considering upward mobility. Eugene has more and more people with disabilities moving here. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but Lila has certainly recognized over the last 4 years that whether it be through, you know, quote unquote greyhound therapy or whatnot, but there's this perception out there that Eugene is kind of a paradise for people with disabilities because we have so many resources, and that's technically not the case, but because of our ethics and morals of the city, you know, we do take very good care of them, but we just have to understand that a lot more people with disabilities are moving here than probably the average time. Another point that came up on my meeting with all my employees is that wealthier citizens should also be included in this process too. And whether that's donation of their time, money, or property, whether that is sitting on these commissions and giving their input into how they would prefer to dense up. And also I would like to include the builders and the developers in that as well. And very much highlight what Eli said about we would very much like to see Eugene businesses to be doing this stuff as long as they agree with our values. My last point I think would be, well, actually I have two, I'm sorry. So on the community, NEDCO is great. And I've been through their programs, but it's not enough to get you there. It's enough to get you a down payment on a car, and it's certainly helpful for financial literacy, but it's not going to get us over that hurdle of how to get long-time renters in. Then second, when considering zoning, please consider public transportation as well. We need an accessible last mile solution. And I'm sure you all probably know what that is, but you know, from the bus stop to the house, you know, or from the taxi to the house, whatever that last mile is. And I love to see that all of these Peace Health bikes have come in, and you know, they're being stationed pretty accordingly. But I've also noticed that, like, what's a person with a physical disability going to do with that bike? You know, so maybe we can either speak with Peace Health and see if they're willing to throw some electric wheelchairs on there, or do it ourselves as a city. But that's probably the last point I wanted to make on that. And thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you setting up this committee.
Thank you, Scott. I think this is the time when we can ask Scott questions. And Elia, is it Elia? Elia as well. So if the commissioners
Elai.
Elai, thank you. I never would have gotten that. Well, I would like to thank you again for your participation in the equity panel. I think it's a wonderful idea. I was very interested in it myself. I know it partially came from the sustainability, and I think what we're learning today is that it's a really wonderful addition to our process. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time this evening to speak with us, and know that the staff is available. And I see Commissioner Taylor has her hand up, and Commissioner Fregula, I see your hand up as well. So maybe Commissioner Taylor, you could go ahead.
Thank you very much for participating tonight and spending all of the time and effort pulling together various people in the community to include voice and participation. So this actually is more of a question for staff, and I wanted to ask it now just so that Aaliyah, did I get that correct? Aaliyah and Scott?
Alai.
Alai, sorry, Alai. L-I-E, got it. And Scott, that you could hear the response, because as you have probably described or talked to with staff, there's your approach, which I actually think is really important, which is the crux of my question, is comprehensive. Whereas the Planning Commission has a more defined role than a lot of the topic areas that you're bringing up. So I guess my question has to do with if staff can talk a little bit about House Bill 2001, kind of what we're talking about in terms of housing. What is the state doing and what is the city doing in order to collectively kind of bring together the important aspects and the bigger aspects of this conversation? So for instance, I mean, Scott brought up elements of funding, banking, there's architecture, meaning building code, which we don't really get into in terms of the Planning Commission, and land use, although we can make suggestions, but it's really, so it gets complex. So staff, if you could address that just for them, and I'm sure you have, as well as the public, because it's much bigger. Transportation, that's fairly connected to planning, yet it's not really in our purview necessarily. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Taylor. That was a big question, but a really important one, so I appreciate it. I'll try to be brief so we can get to hear from Alai and Scott if you have questions for them. But the first thing I would say is that the House bill is fairly prescriptive, as we've talked about, and the rulemaking was going on over the whole course of last year. And so while we were waiting for those rules to be done, we brought together these groups to begin to learn about the House bill, what role it would take in our overall housing picture, and begin to generate people's thoughts about what it would mean to allow more housing in more places. So those were the questions we asked the Equity Roundtable and all of the other groups in the fall. What are your fears and hopes about implementing this legislation? First, learn about the legislation. And then what are your hopes and fears about that? And we didn't touch on it, but the Equity Roundtable actually took it a step further and talked about their worst and best housing experiences in the city of Eugene. And so this is all kind of painting a picture of what's going on with various groups and subpopulations within the community. Then we asked, based on what we heard about those hopes and fears, what values and principles should staff use when drafting the code? So we know we have to draft code that implements the law and the rules, but where we have flexibility, what should guide our choices? That's the question that we asked the community in the groups. And it's actually my next piece of the presentation, but I don't want to jump ahead and get to those staff recommended values and principles until we have time to have a little discussion with Alai and Scott. So the last thing that I would say is that part of House Bill 2001 includes the language to consider affordability policies, and it gives some examples. So while the code requirements are about allowing housing types and under what standards, there's also language that leads cities to consider the affordability in general. And that is something that we're going to have to discuss as a community in terms of how our code solutions fit into the bigger picture. And we may have talked before about this, but we're taking a middle housing update to council at the end of January, and about a month later, they'll begin a more comprehensive housing discussion, following up on the work on housing tools and strategies. So it's a long-winded way of saying we're working on a piece and doing our best to try to fit that into the bigger picture, but we absolutely can't accomplish all of the goals or all of the solutions within the code writing. And I think that's something that's both a constraint and an opportunity.
I've got Commissioner Fragala followed by Commissioner Borowski.
Great, thank you. So I actually have the same question. So thank you for answering it. But I also was very, very curious about the community bank. And Scott, I was wondering if you mentioned some films. I was wondering if you knew the names offhand.
Yeah, I do. I think the first one is called Holding Ground, and the second one is called Standing Ground. I would say the first one is probably more important or relevant to this discussion. And I'm certainly willing to pay for the rights if we need that.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you both very much for being here today.
Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. And thank you guys for the work that you've done, giving input to us as commissioners. As Terry mentioned, we have prescriptive things that we have to look at that are written from the state, but we also have some areas that we can work towards community goals, and that's where your guys' input helps me to decide, should we, is neighborhood livability a high priority, and what can we do within the code that the state lets us do to help do that? Can we do things that help with transit, like Scott mentioned, to help incentivize some of these types of housing near transit and those types of things? And there's ways of doing that with incentives or with lessening of certain restrictions that the state lets us do. And by your guys giving us your input, that helps me as specifically to help make those decisions, and not just through my lens, because my lens is, it's what I see and what I experience. But by having you guys come and give your testimony and your input, that gives me a larger set of lenses to look through when we're making these decisions. So I really appreciate you guys coming and doing the work that you do and the volunteers. So thank you very much.
Commissioner Isaacson, then back to Commissioner Taylor.
I want to also echo those. I really enjoyed the presentation. One of my little soapbox things is the growing wealth gap for people who are younger than I am, particularly the millennials and people kind of coming up the ladder. I know that 8% of that the millennials are actually owning homes at 8% less than the generations that came after them, like my generation and on. And that has a real effect on down the ladder economics across the board. That equates to about 1.3 million houses that would be occupied and owned by people who are younger than I am. And so while this particular body doesn't have a great deal of jurisdiction in all the areas you talked about, it is a lens that if we're looking through to find ways that we can kind of chip away at that. I always like the saying that no one raindrop believes it's responsible for the flood, but it is. So, from our perspective, what can we do to look at where we can make a difference in the areas you kind of selected? So I really appreciate your thoughts and presentation. Thank you both.
Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. Just one more comment. you both were very articulate and I think shared important information. And what I have found historically is participation at the adoption level and even working up to the adoption level. The participants, and it's hard. It actually is a direct equity issue, is that those that have the ability to take off work and attend meetings and participate can go to evening meetings. I mean, it is a select population that can actually participate. So what I'd love to see is what are some tools that potentially, and it might be other departments, what can we do as a community to help so that the participation for this very involved and important topic, that all voices can be heard at these levels? Because I would love to be at a planning commission meeting during the adoption process and have a diverse voice that is participating in that process, as well as city council, because I think there will be a higher level of accountability by those in privilege. Honestly, if there is a conversation that is more diverse. Yeah, so I'm not sure what we can do, and it is the community involvement piece, which we are responsible for. So what do we do to actually, because you're both taking time out of your evening, but how can we make sure that at least your voices are heard throughout the process and maybe grow those voices? So thank you.
May I answer that question?
Yes, of course.
Okay. I just want to clarify that Scott is the one here who's totally showing up in a voluntary fashion. I am a consultant that works for the city. And so, just to be fair, I'm here just presenting the findings of the equity roundtable that I've been facilitating with my team. So what you were sharing with us, Commissioner Taylor, is really real question about how is it that we can increase participation of different communities in all these forums and spaces where decision-making happens. And I think from my experience facilitating the climate action plan with the Office of Sustainability, and also working now on the Middle Housing Code with Terry and the whole team, these equity spaces, equity roundtables, equity forums, spaces where people can actually talk about the realities that historically underserved communities are facing in Eugene do make a difference, right? Like you feel, because you're actually in a space where you know that you're going to be heard and respected and honored. And that's what I've seen in all these kind of spaces. I've been able to hear people share their experiences and actually have staff engage that in a real serious and concrete way. There's many other ways to do that. We don't have enough time here to delve into all the possibilities on how to engage people more in the political process. I do feel like this process is at least our way to get people started, to have that kind of engagement. And, and finding ways to instill more faith in that if people show up, that it will make a difference. And I think sometimes people just feel like, am I gonna take my time and go and speak? And would that actually be heard? So definitely a really important question, and something that I have seen now in these two different experiences, and having been myself in focus groups led by the city and ad hoc committees, how important it is to create those really specific spaces where we can actually engage the process, definitely.
Okay, terrific. So I've got Commissioner Beeson followed by Commissioner Taylor. I'm sorry, Commissioner, looking right at you. And what was your name again? Edwards, you're next. Beeson, up.
Thanks. I also want to say thank you to LIE and Scott for talking with us, and appreciate all that. I was taking notes, and I found over the last several months as we've worked on this, one of the kind of foundation issues, if you will, that we just continue to hear about is affordability. There are different people in the community kind of weighing in on it, different ideas about how you might achieve it or not, what kind of issues there are, and so on. And I'm pretty interested in it. So I think that I heard Terry talk about it, and I know we're going to be doing more work on it, but I think the idea of us being able to pretty clearly define what it is as it applies to this code work and to the scope of work that the Planning Commission is involved in here. I find myself trying to think through what all of the different attributes, I guess for lack of a better word, attributes might be of affordability as part of this middle housing implementation. And then, how we can, what opportunities we have to get that connected to the work we're doing on code amendments and so on. So it's very helpful to me, helpful to everybody I'm hearing, to hear the kinds of perspectives you've brought. So thanks very much.
Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you, Chair Ramey. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight to talk with us. And I would definitely echo some of the comments from my colleagues, emphasizing the importance to take in your perspectives that you're sharing with us tonight as we move through this process. The experiences that you share are very different than mine in particular. And I know that that's the case across the board. And I think it's really important. And as decision makers, it's so important that we hear the other experiences. You've really helped me highlight why this work in general is so important. I've been a big advocate for House Bill 2001 through a number of different avenues and organizations that I'm involved with. And you really helped me understand why that is so important, because we know that there are a lot of voices in our community and they all deserve equal time at the mic to be heard. But I do think that I think Commissioner Taylor touched on it a little bit. I think that, coming from a place of privilege, it really, I don't experience the problems that House Bill 2001 addresses. And so I think it's really important that we understand that. And I'll also just share that as a member of the executive team for LTD, we are very actively looking at what we call our first and last mile. And Scott, your points were well taken. It's a challenge for us. It always has been, but we definitely continue to work on that. And so while it's outside the purview of this particular commission, I just want you to know that we hear you loud and clear. So hopefully we can make some progress on that.
I don't see any other. Yeah, I see some hands are still up, but I think there's a delay here in the system maybe. So with that, Terry, I think we're ready to move forward onto our next topic.
Thank you. And thanks again to LIE and Scott for joining us. Of course, you're welcome to stay, but you're also welcome to hop off if you have other things you'd rather be doing. You commissioners all asked a ton of questions that foreshadow the rest of the presentation. So I'm really looking forward to it. I didn't want to cut you off, but I also wanted to say, we're gonna talk about that. Questions about economics, questions about how to use the principles, and then how to offer up choices. So we're gonna get right into that. So I'll share my screen again. And let's see. One. Here we go. As you heard, the groups spent some time suggesting values and principles, and some of the groups came up with very long lists, and it was a challenge for staff to try to synthesize and summarize all of these things. But that's what we need to do to make it a manageable list to use as we go forward into code writing. So these are attached to your packet, the full values and principles. I've just shown the headings here on the slide. But they were written by city staff using words and phrases suggested by the outreach groups in the fall, as was just presented by the Equity Roundtable representatives. Many themes were suggested by more than one group, including access and equity, affordability and sustainability, discussed many times at the boards and commissions, local partners, and equity roundtables, and also the Healthy Democracy Panel and the student outreach. So we got it down to 8. The outreach groups also discussed wanting to foster a sense of belonging for all, create wealth building opportunities, as we've just discussed. Recognize the regulatory actions required by House Bill 2001 as part of a bigger picture of housing work, and increase the vibrancy of Eugene's neighborhoods, which is a lot about safety and walkable and bikeable neighborhoods. Together, the values and principles will be used by staff as we work with consultants to draft code and policy language to implement the law. We, of course, welcome Planning Commission feedback and discussion of these draft principles, although it does we've covered some of it already, and if you'd prefer to roll into the next part of the presentation, that would be fine too. The only other thing I want to say before we either break for more discussion or move on is that when we were talking about representation and access, I wanted to remind you that we're providing stipends to Healthy Democracy participants and Equity Roundtable organizations. And we also have consultants, as LIE mentioned, that are working on the project, but that is not insignificant. And I know it's very much appreciated by those who are participating, who have never participated before. So I just wanted to remind you about that, and then take a pause and see if you wanted to have time for questions about values and principles, or if you'd like to move ahead to the technical update.
Well, Terry, just speaking selfishly for myself, I would like to push forward because I know there's a lot of material to cover. And I think my issues are about how these principles get applied and can we track them as we move forward. So it's really about going forward. And secondarily, then the principles that are covered by other areas of the city, we somehow pass those on and leave tracks that we pass them on. So these participants in the equity panels and the other panels can see where their work went, and we leave tracks that show where their work. That's what my broad comment. I see, Commissioner Taylor, your hand is up.
It's all right. I can wait until the end.
Okay. So with that, Terry, I think we're ready to move forward. I saw some heads nodding, and I think we'll get into it.
That's great. Of course, we'll still have time at the end of the meeting. So if you want to circle back to anything or anything that I talked about in the beginning, we can do that too. So I'm going to share again, and Tyler, get ready. You're going to come on in a couple slides. Okay. So the technical update today begins with a piece on economic feasibility from Tyler Bump at Echo Northwest. And then Matt Hasty will talk with us about the state rules and minimum compliance standards and how they'll be used along with the values and principles to create design and code concepts. So over to Tyler.
Thank you, Terry. And good evening, commissioners. Wait for the next slide to move on here. Maybe a quick intro. My name is Tyler Bump. I'm a project director at Echo Northwest and also our practice area lead for our housing policy development work across our firm. And excited to be talking with you all tonight about the economic and development feasibility as part of this middle housing HB 2001 implementation work. And do want to give kudos to the Eugene staff team. They've been just doing an amazing job and very thoughtful in how they're approaching this work. So I do want to give them acknowledgement for the work that they're doing here. Our task here with this work is looking at evaluating the likelihood of different types of middle housing and how they develop or could develop in different areas based on differences in market and site conditions across Eugene. And the way that we're doing that is we're testing out multiple versions, physical development versions of all of the housing types under HB 2001. So we're looking at different types of configurations of duplexes, configurations of triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, cottage clusters. And not only testing different versions of those middle housing types, we're also testing how they perform from a feasibility perspective spatially across Eugene, given the different markets that exist across the city of Eugene. So we're giving you an update today on our work so far. We've got some preliminary findings that we're sharing with you. We've got some work to do to refine our findings moving forward. But today we're going to talk about the market broadly in Eugene for middle housing, a little bit of discussion about which types of middle housing are most likely to get built. And we're going to talk a little bit about the estimated prices for new middle housing compared to new single family housing, and have a little bit of a discussion around how that's helpful in keeping Eugene affordable longer term. So next slide, please, Terry. So first note, Eugene's market for middle housing. Before I get into this, I would say that we are doing quite a bit of middle housing work given HB 2001 in Oregon, but also in Washington and the Puget Sound, quite a bit in California. And Eugene has actually seen quite a bit of middle housing development. And this housing development, middle housing types, have happened in lower and medium density multifamily zones. But Eugene has good examples of what this housing could look like and can look like, which a lot of other cities throughout the country just don't have as we're having these conversations. So we're leading on the examples of development that have happened across the city, and looking at different housing types and how they build out under the market conditions in Eugene. One other thing we're looking at a mixture of for sale and rental housing types. So we're looking at different kinds of different development prototypes for each housing type. We're also looking at rental product and ownership product. And then we're looking at spatially different prices and rents, how they exist across different neighborhoods and different areas of Eugene. Next slide, please. So our preliminary high-level findings here, we want to share some things with you. The first key point here, key finding, is that building for sale middle housing is more financially viable than rental housing in most areas. So we're finding that the for sale product, an ownership product, buy a townhome, buy a condo in a triplex, is, from a feasibility perspective, is slightly outperforming rental units. Rental housing is still feasible in many situations, but the for sale housing is oftentimes more feasible than rental housing. Two side-by-side attached units can fit physically on many residential lots across Eugene, and also may be financially feasible in smaller lots in many areas. So the duplex situation on smaller lots across Eugene is feasible in many cases, most cases. I shouldn't say most, in many cases across Eugene. Builders and buyers prefer fee simple over condo housing. And I want to pause here and sort of explain the difference between fee simple and condo. So when we say fee simple, we mean you own a unit. So if you think about a townhouse, you might have 3 or 4 units in a townhouse. Fee simple is where somebody owns the unit and owns the land underneath the unit. A condo is where you own the unit and you have a shared ownership of the land through a homeowners association or an HOA structure. There's a couple of reasons why both buyers and builders prefer fee simple. From a builder perspective, it's more straightforward. There's more of a market for buyers that are interested in fee simple over condos. Condos still work pretty well, but there's a preference for sure within the market, the buyer's market, for fee simple ownership. And so that really relates to the ability to split a lot into smaller individually owned parcels within the context of middle housing. Where 4 side-by-side units, attached units, can fit on a 7,000 square foot lot, this is likely to be financially feasible in many areas if builders are willing to build condos. So the 4 unit on the 7,000 square foot-ish size lot is feasible in many places, as long as builders are willing to build condos, which they are. There's just less of a market for buyers, but it is something that does exist pretty broadly within the market today. And then one sort of unique thing about the Eugene market is just the role that the university plays and that student housing plays in the housing market. And so we looked at a couple of unique student housing types of middle housing that are a little bit different. So we kind of thought about these as, you've got 2-bedroom unit, each bedroom has a bathroom, you've got a shared common space in the middle. And so when we started looking at that type of housing, it actually performs really well near the university as well, which isn't surprising. There is a little bit of funkiness going on in the market given COVID and everything within rental housing, student rental housing across Eugene, but longer term, definitely a market for middle housing, student-oriented plexes. Next slide, please. And so we want to talk a little bit about the differences in pricing between middle housing and single-family detached housing. I have found that this has been really helpful as to set a baseline for sort of common understanding for legislative bodies to think about what different price points middle housing is versus single family. So new middle housing, what we're looking at generally housing prices, for sale housing prices between $230,000 per unit and $485,000 per unit, and monthly rents between $1,500 a month and $2,900 a month. When I get through the next one, I'll talk about why that is and what these ranges mean. For new single-family detached housing, a much wider range, but generally between $250,000 for a single-family detached house to over $1 million for a new construction single-family detached house, and rents for new construction single-family happening between $1,700 and $3,000 a month. I would note on the single detached side that Eugene's market for new construction single-family across the city generally is falling between $450,000 and $550,000 for new construction single-family. Because we are looking at different markets and different neighborhoods and different areas across Eugene as part of this, I think it's worth noting that on the lower end of both the middle housing and the single-family detached, there are specific areas. So like the Bethel neighborhood is the neighborhood that has more of the lower cost new construction single-family. Parts of Northeast, Cal Young, Harlow have more new construction single-family in that 450 to 550 range. And then in Southwest Hills and Friendly, you've got more of that upper end of the 550 to 700,000, 650,000 or so. So the prices range and they vary depending on where you are. The differences between the pricing for new construction single-family and middle housing, there's really two big things happening there. Why middle housing is less expensive than detached single-family housing. One is the cost of the land getting split between more units. So there's an efficiency in land costs getting spread between more units. The other thing, and I think which is actually a bigger impact on increasing affordability through middle housing, is on the unit size. So units get less expensive as they get smaller. And so when you're building a triplex or a fourplex, you're not building as big of units, because those units aren't as big. They're generally going to be less expensive than a larger 2,000 square foot detached single family. So there's this relationship between size and price where middle housing is helpful in a sort of single family context. And so a little bit on the pricing and what that means in Eugene and Lane County. This is actually a graphic from the Lane County Affordable Housing Action Plan that was recently adopted. And we've got a bar square shape around this income band where most new middle housing is affordable to these different income levels. And this is following at generally between a little bit of above 80% AMI up to about 140% AMI. And so that's the sort of market rate middle housing pricing that we're seeing in Eugene is pretty consistent with what we see across other markets in the Northwest. I do want to mention 100% AMI here as some context. For a family of three is about $63,000 a year and about $1,600 a month at 100% AMI for a three-person household for both rental or owner. So in the context of occupations and households and families, we're talking about a logging equipment operator or a plumber or a massage therapist, generally in this price range of 80 to 120% AMI. The single family context on here is a little bit further. We couldn't actually put a box on here because the ranges go so far off of this chart. But single family detached is generally ranges from a little bit past this line here on the low end and then way past the line on the upper end as well. So a little bit of context about middle housing pricing versus AMI and what that means across Lane County as well. Next slide, please. And I wanted to keep it short because I know folks are going to have lots of questions. So
that was the last one.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that. I know for sure, again, speaking selfishly, I've been eagerly awaiting this kind of information, trying to link affordability with this idea of middle housing. So very helpful for me. I've got Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions and I took some notes here, so hopefully I'm organized in my thoughts. So I had a question, Tyler, about the, I hear, and I would love for confirmation, but some of the issues with condominiums in the state of Oregon have to do with a liability requirement of the builder of like 10 years or something like that. And I'm just curious about whether or not that issue applies to these other forms of for sale middle housing units. Are you familiar with this? And maybe I'm.
Yeah, you're right. It's a construction defect law.
Yeah.
And so you essentially have to buy an insurance policy. Many developers have to buy an insurance policy when they're building condos and HOAs as a sort of liability insurance. It is costly. There has been some discussion at the state legislature over the last few years on addressing construction defect liability. But yeah, the state of Washington made some changes in the 2019 legislative session. We're tracking that closely. It takes a little while for that to filter through the risk profile, how insurers think about risk and decreasing rates and things like that. But it is helpful, and it's an important thing, I think, for folks to realize is a cost.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing then is, because I am familiar, at least with, I didn't know, but so is it applicable to some of these housing types that you're talking about? You're talking about the oh, I didn't write it down. The type of units where you own the land underneath. I have it.
Yeah,
I can go.
So that's part of the
Fee Simple.
Yeah, so it's part of the reason why Fee Simple is more attractive, because you don't have to have an HOA essentially for Fee Simple development. So it reduces risk for both the builder, and there's a higher buyer pool potentially for folks that don't want to have an HOA. HOAs can be structured very different ways. They can be less expensive, they can be more expensive. It really depends on the builder and the HOA organization themselves once they get up and running. But I can give you a range of HOA costs for this type of housing that we see is generally between $80 to $150 a month in HOA costs associated with condos.
Thank you, super helpful. The only other little, I don't know if it's a question or more just a comment. I didn't see, in looking at the slide on the pricing of middle housing versus single detached, I'll be honest, I look at that and side by side, it's, to me, when I'm thinking about a monthly mortgage payment, you're talking about $100. So sometimes that doesn't like strike me as the end all be all. Oh, we're gonna meet this market that isn't currently being served. But I do think that it's important to acknowledge that there are other components to middle housing, such as the number of households that we have in our community that are like 1 or 2 people, and a single family home is more than enough for them. And so this type of housing really does accommodate different lifestyle and different psychographics as well as simple demographics. But then also the creation of available units by people moving into and out of, like that scenario I mentioned, where you have a retired couple, it's just the 2 of them, they're in a 4-bedroom home, they don't have anywhere else to go because we don't have a lot of what they would be interested in. They want to buy something. And so by moving into a middle housing unit where they don't have to deal with a yard, they don't have to deal with all those things, and it's more suitable to their needs at that time. Now they're freeing up an older home that may be more affordable to a family or something of that sort. So I think that I just kind of want to mention that is really one of the other big components of where middle housing can really help us fill some gaps in our community.
Yeah, Commissioner Edwards, I'd agree with that. I think we're looking specifically on development feasibility impacts, looking at outcomes from middle housing as a housing type. There are a lot of things that middle housing helps advance that were listed in the values slides that Terry presented that have been discussed as part of the equity roundtable, and I've heard about come up in our healthy democracy panel when I was there. So I think there's a lot of non-feasibility things that are helpful, but you're absolutely right. In the context of overall housing options and housing choice, there is a need, and an increasing need, for different housing choice to meet the needs of different residents across our communities. This is one way to do it, and I would agree with that.
Got Commissioner Taylor, followed by Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you, Tyler. That was great. Actually, my question is similar to Commissioner Edwards' last statement, and you addressed it. Is there a way to quantify and put in an economic position what happens in terms of that mobility? I'm just curious if Eco Northwest has done that, because I think it would be interesting and potentially persuasive to look at the economics of what happens when you have choice.
I would say that, and I've been working on middle housing work for about 5 years now, which seems like a really long time given the chaos of the world, and also middle housing as a topic has been really interesting for that 5 years. There hasn't been a lot of literature or a lot of research done, and so there's not a lot of literature for us to reference in terms of empirical research. We are starting to pull some things together as middle housing specific literature comes out and research is done. I think, you know, we've done a lot of work on housing under production in terms of overall production, overall supply relative to demand. I think that's a big part of it. You know, AARP actually has some great research that they've done on middle housing and the need for folks that are aging in the community specifically. But there hasn't been a lot of great research done. We've pulled some things together. I can see what we've got. We'll certainly put that in as footnotes and sort of framing in our report when we finish that up as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of slides were very informative to me, and the last one being the fact that we're looking at these types of housing for 80% AMI to up to 140% AMI. You know, when we heard from the equity people, there was a lot of talk about affordability. And if you go to the slide right above that and you say, new construction on missing middle is going to run from $230,000 to basically $500,000 a unit, people are going to say that's not affordable. And what I have to say to that is, that's right. That may not be affordable for somebody at 60% AMI. And there are areas of the city, programs in the city that are trying to find those types of housing as well. What HB 2001 was, and what City Council was asking, was missing middle, which is, to me, is that 80 to 140 AMI. So when we get pushback from people saying, oh, you're just building pretty little houses for rich people, I've got to back away from that a little bit. I think, like Commissioner Edwards says, is anytime when we can increase the amount of housing in the community, that helps ease the burden on all aspects of the community. But I think we will get pushback from people saying that, you know, I can't afford a $485,000, 1,000 square foot condo. And I can understand that. A lot of people can't, but there are people in our community who can and want it. The other question that I had for you, Tyler, was you were looking at pricing out new construction of duplexes, triplexes, and quads. One of the things that is allowed under the new Senate bill is converting a house from a single family to a duplex. Was there any financial analysis as to, if I've got a house and I want to add an 800 foot or a 1,000 foot addition to that house and make it a duplex, to me that's going to be less than the $230,000 to $485,000. Was there any analysis on expanding existing dwellings?
I was going to wait for Terry and see if Terry would say something. I would say that there's a HB 2001 is around allowing these things in residential zones, and whether you do that through new construction or through a renovation of an existing structure. I think we're definitely focused on new housing production as a new construction, infill, or redevelopment scenario. we have done work before on renovations, and you'd be kind of surprised at how expensive that is once you start to get above 2 units, because you hit commercial building code and you've got to retrofit, you've got to do seismic improvements, and you have to make all of these other sort of IBC building code requirements that can be cost prohibitive for retrofitting existing structures. But there are other folks that do that on their own, and it is less expensive. So I think the renovation thing is harder for us to get a handle on. It's harder to get a sense of the scale or magnitude of what that could do, because you'd have to look and say, are we, looking at every 2-story structure that has an unfinished attic and an unfinished basement, and sort of how do we think about that? But there has been some work done on the barriers associated with internal conversions. But we do see them play out, and I do think it's something that will happen within the market if it's allowed.
Okay, I've got Commissioner Fregula. I'd like to jump in here myself if I can. So go ahead, Commissioner Fregula.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned that Eugene actually had a lot of good examples of middle housing had more examples than other communities. And I'm wondering, when you think about those examples, if there are some that trend towards being more affordable, because when we look at that range of housing that you offered in this slide, $230,000 might not sound inexpensive for a house, but when you look at what's available on the market now, like things that are out there for 350 are, they're not in great shape, and they're kind of run down. So a new home for 230 for a younger family would be a good option. So I'm curious, when you look at, I'm curious, like, how do we push towards that end of the spectrum to create more affordable housing at that range? So when you talk about the good examples that are in our community, do you see something that's trending as more affordable?
I do. And even in our analysis, things get more affordable as you get more units and the units get a little bit smaller. And so there's an efficiency that happens with development that, a 4-bed or a unit in a 4-unit building is going to be less expensive than a unit in a duplex, because the land is getting split between more units, and because of the limitations on total square footage allowances, those units are going to be smaller. So I would say that if you're targeting affordability, it is thinking about on the upper end of the density spectrum of middle housing, which is 4plexes, townhomes, triplexes, versus the duplex side of it. I can give you one example. I think it's the Friendly Street Commons townhouse project. I found when it was built in, I think, 2015, the unit sold for $250,000. I saw that it sold again in 2017 for, I think it was $290,000. I saw that it sold a couple months ago for $320,000. So that shows me that that is an affordable product type when it gets built. Somebody has access to that. As the market increases, this gets to that wealth generation piece, or really a community stability piece. You have an opportunity to access that housing at a price point. If things get more expensive, you're in it. If you sell it, that's a wealth building, wealth generation opportunity for folks that might otherwise not have had that opportunity. So I think the townhouse thing is really helpful. All of it is helpful in the context of just adding different options for folks at different price points. I think it's all helpful.
So I've got a couple of things here. So it's our slide 22, I think it is. It's the one that says middle housing affordability. I think you said you got it from the Lane County Housing Action Plan recently. And to me, this is a slide that there's missing a couple pieces of data, but I think it's a slide that we could use to tell our story. And I think it's a slide that really led to House Bill 2001, if we can add these data points. The data points are, in our community, how many of these units do we currently have? And so I think you're going to find that there's a lot of them not even on the slide, but there'll be a few on this slide. So sort of how many units do we currently have in the community that fall in these price points? And then secondarily, and this is the part that caught my attention, I don't know, Terry, what was it, 2 years ago, I came to one of those planning open houses for all, and y'all had this chart that lined up the income of the city with the housing that was affordable at that income point, and the mismatch was dramatic. And so I think if we can add that data point to this as well, so it's two things. What is the household income for our community? How is that spread across this? And then what is the housing that's available? And you'll see, I think you'll see that there's a mismatch there. And so that, to me, needs to be one of the first ways we tell the story. Why are we pursuing this at all? It's obvious to us, but I think to someone who's just beginning to look at it, we get at Commissioner Borowski's point, well, we're really building little cute houses for the rich people, or who are the rich people? And to me, that's all about defining what is affordable. What do we mean when we say affordable? Because I think different people have different thoughts about what that means. And I think for us, for 2001, we're trying to get this thing that's in the middle. We have low income housing that's over here, and then we have market housing, which is over here, at least market housing, but we're really trying to expand our market this way, with my hand the right way. So there's more of the market that's in that middle section. So if we had those two data points, I think when we tell the story right at the very beginning, this is House Bill 2001, look at this gap here. We have these people making this much money and there's nowhere for them to live. They simply can't afford it because that kind of unit doesn't exist. I hope what I'm saying is actually true, by the way, but I think it is. But that's just a better way to tell the story. So that would be my, if you can add that to your data here, I think that would really help us tell the story starting at the beginning of why did we even go down this path? So that would be, I don't have a question. That's like a request. If that's at all possible, I think that would really help us tell the story.
Mr. Rainey, I hear you loud and clear, and I hear the energy around affordability across the entire commission. So thank you for asking all these questions. I do want to do a time check because we have another big piece to get to. And it's kind of forecasting what we're going to get into in a lot of detail in your February 1st work session. So I think it's okay that we've gone this far, but if we could wrap up a couple of final questions, that would be really good.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for keeping us aware of the time. So Commissioner Beeson, I saw your hand up and I saw Commissioner Taylor's hand up as well.
Thanks. I'll try to pay attention to time too, and I'll try to be brief. I guess kind of for Tyler, I was talking a little bit earlier about attributes of affordable housing, and so I appreciate your presentation. And I looked through the slides. I watched your presentation to the Healthy Democracy Group and went through those slides too. And I guess beyond the individual units and the prices of the units and all of that, there's aspects to do with relative locations of all of this within the community and locations of it relative to transportation, proximity to mixed use or commercial mixed use development that kind of go into the whole equation of affordability. Can you react to that, talk about that just a bit?
Sure. One thing, a sort of aha moment I've had in the middle housing work is, yeah, transit access is important and access to daily commercial service is important. One of the other things I think in middle housing and single family context, or a couple other things, are neighborhood schools is a good thing that we don't necessarily think about, or neighborhood parks. And so there are these location attributes or location amenities that have real health and quality of life impacts for folks within our communities, and we should think about those. So yeah, I agree with you. It's important to think about. I think, one of the things that we're working with Eugene on is to understand the locations of where housing is relative to infrastructure needs. So that's like a big question is, and I would think about schools and parks as infrastructure, right? And so what is the infrastructure and how are communities served by those things that are super important and honestly lead to economic mobility. You're right, like decreasing transportation costs, having access to transportation, big deal in terms of affordability. Access to healthy food in the grocery store, big thing in terms of economic mobility. They're all connected. I agree with you. It's an important part of it.
Thanks.
Okay, Commissioner Taylor, keeping in mind that Terry is eager for us to move on.
I'm just gonna forfeit my question.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'll make it up to you later, promise. Okay, Terry.
Okay. Back to sharing my screen. And I'm gonna kick it over to Matt to start on this one. Matt.
All right, thanks, Terry, and thanks to you all for having me here. It's good to see you again. I don't have a ton of slides. I'll go through them not so quickly, not too quickly, but reasonably quickly given the time here. So first is just to kind of talk about where we are in this process on the middle housing code work. When I last saw you in December, the rules had just been adopted. They were fresh off the presses. So they were adopted on December 9th. And we had provided a summary to you all and kind of went through some of the highlights of that at that meeting. We had talked about some of the highlights of the rules. We'd started to talk about, where within Eugene are these rules going to apply? What are some of the points where you'll have some flexibility in terms of how you update your code and still are consistent with the administrative rules? And so we've already started to think about that, and we've continued to think about that in terms of where's the flexibility, where are the choices and options for you all. And we've also been thinking about how do we frame that conversation about what those options are when we go out and talk to other folks in the community, when we talk to you, but also when we go out and talk to other folks in the community. And Terry mentioned earlier that we're expecting to be doing that. We've been doing a certain amount of it already with the Healthy Democracy and equity panels, but more of it particularly in February. So we're starting to frame these questions. And one of the ways that we're talking about framing the question is what are sort of the different levels of implementation you could look at in terms of amending your code to address the middle housing rules. And so that's what I'm going to kind of focus on tonight. So we've started to frame this in terms of kind of these three levels of implementation. Allow, so meeting the minimum standards. We sort of think of really those standards for the most part as a floor. You can't really drop down into you don't have a lot of options to drop down into the basement. You got to kind of stay on the first floor here. Or do you want to go further? Do you want to encourage, update your code in a way that further encourages middle housing beyond just the floor of the standards? When I spoke to the folks on the Healthy Democracy panel briefly a month or so ago, that was a question they asked me was, what can we do to encourage development of these forms of housing? Or do you want to go beyond that and move towards incentivizing, further kind of providing even more flexibility or fewer regulations, and also starting to think about how do you apply bonuses or incentives? And I'll say just a little bit more about this on this next slide here. So again, the thing that HB 2001 does is says you need to, as a city, allow middle housing in more places across the city of Eugene. So that's kind of the allow piece. Again, what can you do to encourage these forms of housing? And Tyler's kind of has talked about what these can look like to some degree. And in terms of incentivizing middle housing, are there particularly places where you want to do that? So we've talked a little bit earlier today about how important it is to have housing that's affordable and accessible to people in areas that are close to transit service, that are within walking distance of commercial services. And so are there ways to incentivize development of middle housing in those areas in particular, kind of with that level of implementation? So I'm just going to give a few quick examples of specific, get kind of down into the weeds, although not as far down into the weeds as we're likely to get in that next section or session where we take kind of a deep dive on this stuff, but a little bit down into the weeds on some examples of specific types of standards and what that could mean in terms of these different levels of implementation: allow, encourage, incentivize. And I will say that these are just a few examples. This doesn't in any way sort of look at the full universe of different types of code provisions or options that we could be looking at here, but we thought it would be helpful to just start to talk about this in these terms. So thinking about lot size, and this is an example of a triplex in R1 zone. The administrative rules say you need to allow triplexes on lots that are 5,000 square feet. So that's the allow kind of level. You could choose to encourage development of that form of housing by allowing a triplex on a smaller lot. For example, a 4,500 square foot lot, that's what you allow a single family detached home on now in that zone. You could further incentivize this form of housing by allowing additional units or allowing triplexes on even smaller lots. If, for instance, again, you're in an area that's accessible to transit, or if those units are affordable to people with a certain median income, and if there's a commitment, for example, to those remaining affordable to that income level for some period of time. So that gets to the incentivize. Terry's doing a good job at keeping me moving through the slides. Thank you, Terry. Off-street parking, another kind of example of a standard that we'll be looking at as part of this work. So again, taking that triplex and an R1 zone example, the rules say you can't require more than 3 off-street parking spaces for a triplex, 1 per unit. That's your floor in terms of what you can require. If a developer wants to provide more parking, you can let them provide more, but you can't require more than that. In your code, you could go further than that in terms of encouraging the ability to build triplexes in that zone by requiring even fewer off-street spaces. One way you could do that would be to say, hey, you get a credit for any on-street parking that's available in front of or close to that, that triplex. So that's one way to kind of reduce what's required off-street. And this kind of gets to that affordability level as well. The less space you need to provide on a site for parking, the easier it is to make that development financially feasible. If you want to go kind of all the way to incentivize, you could require even less parking, no parking, for instance. And again, you could apply that in specific areas or in situations where the units are affordable to people or households in different income ranges. So that example. Lot coverage, in this case, the allow is that you need to, you can't require lower lot coverage than what you require for single family detached homes. So in the R1 zone, that's 50% lot coverage. If you want to encourage or make it somewhat more feasible to build a triplex, to build 3 units on the same size lot, you could encourage that by increasing the allowable lot coverage up to 60%. That just provides more flexibility. It also kind of expands the range of the size of units you could build on a particular lot, particularly a smaller lot. So that encourages or provides more flexibility. You could go even further and increase that lot coverage to 70% or even higher. I will note that once you start getting to a certain point, it starts to interact with some of your other development code standards, setbacks, and things like that, setbacks, landscaping, et cetera. So you'll have to start to look at, if you want to go there, you'll have to look at some of those other code provisions and how they kind of interact with lot coverage. And then I think the next one's my last one. So then the other example we have here are design standards. And the administrative rules basically kind of distinguish between siting and design standards. So here we're talking about things like design of the facade of the structure or the width of parking areas or things like that. So here we actually sort of identified the existing standard on this slide. And in this case, you've got some pretty detailed standards, design standards for multifamily, which currently apply to middle housing types as well. And the administrative rules say you can only apply a limited set of standards, essentially the ones in the model code, unless you can show that any alternative standards that you apply do not result in unreasonable cost or delay in the development of middle housing. So some of those detailed standards that you currently apply in multifamily, you are not, frankly, going to be able to apply to middle housing in the future. So in terms of allowing, again, kind of the floor here is to apply what is included in the model code. It's a fairly limited set of design standards. They relate to entry orientation, percentage of windows, and the width of garages or driveways. Again, if you want to go the encourage route, you provide even more flexibility or fewer standards related to those design attributes of middle housing. Incentivize, go even further in that direction. And again, do that for certain types of developments or in certain areas, if that's where you're really trying to incentivize some of this development. I think is that my last one, Terry?
Yep.
I think it is. All right, so that was some fast talking. Thanks for bearing with me there, and I'll be happy to answer some questions before Terry wraps us up.
You've stunned them. Okay, there we go.
Oh, here we go. Commissioner Taylor, please.
All right.
So I know that your presentation is pretty simple, straightforward at this, or simple at this level, higher level. I also know you will be looking at this, but it's something I wanted to kind of bring up at this point, and that is land use applications, so public process. So I think removing barriers in terms of procedure types associated with middle housing, I'm going to be looking at that because it just adds more burden to development. So I know you'll probably be looking at that, but for instance, our multifamily, what is being required, and in order to have more discretion, and then an adjustment review potentially is triggered. Or if you want a smaller lot size than 4,500, now you've got a PUD. So are there ways for us to explore kind of where these triggers are for land use applications and how to remove those barriers?
Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, that is something you're going to have to look at. That is something that administrative rules address. One, that you do need to provide clear and objective standards for middle housing in terms of the code requirements, but also the permitting process or procedures that you take people through. So that is something we're going to have to look at here. Tyler noted that, they're looking at this in a number of other communities, and we are as well. And so that's a thing that's coming up, I think, even more so in, for instance, Wilsonville. Almost everything goes through a PUD there. And that is something that they are going to have to change to some degree. So yeah, that is absolutely something that we'll be looking at as part of this.
Okay, Commissioner Borofsky.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. And I'm just gonna, since we're short on time, I just want to throw something out there. And it goes to cost. One of the things, like Commissioner Taylor said, how can we bring down cost of developing these types of things, these types of housing? And I'm curious if there's other areas in the code that will interact with these types of housings being built in R1 neighborhoods. And what I'm getting to is something that was brought up in my new position as an EWEB commissioner. The cost that it costs for you to connect your EWEB to a new housing. You have to, right now the code says you have to underground. Well, if you're in a neighborhood that is all overhead and the house next to you is a line and it costs you $1,000 to string a line to a duplex, but since you're doing a duplex there, you have to underground it and it's going to cost you $10,000. Is that an area of the code that we could look at as well to try and make adjustments to make some of these fees and costs that are incurred with our code be less obtrusive. You know, it's going to be a house that's the whole block is going to be wired from the pole to the house, and then you've got the new one that's going to go under. Just a thought, something that was brought up in a meeting that I was in yesterday.
I'm going to say good thought. I'm going to also see if Terry has anything to say on that one before I say too much.
And we don't have to answer that now. That's just something that I'm throwing in the hopper for down the road.
That's what I was going to say. Thank you for the idea, John, and we'll take it under consideration.
Commissioner Taylor.
Sorry, I just had one more follow through. So thanks, Matt. The LIE and Scott, I actually think so land use applications, while it involves public process, my experience with Eugene, and it's directly related to equity, is those that have time to actually attend public hearings, appeal applications, tend to be those with financial ability and time. I rarely see a full audience, people appealing a development by a diverse group of people. Tends to be fairly privileged. So that's why land use applications and having more clear and objective standards that there's by right ability to develop housing. It also has a direct correlation with cost. And like I said, direct correlation with discrimination. So I think our task as a planning commission is to look at those embedded institutionalized discrimination and inequities that are involved in planning and our land use regulations.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I'll just quick little anecdote. I was talking to an affordable housing developer. When I say affordable, in this case, somebody who's developing housing for people who make at or below 80% of annual median income, and talking to him about how, for instance, a city could be successful in partnering with a group like that to get some of those units built. And he said, first, make sure we don't have to go through a conditional use process. Make sure we don't have to go through any kind of type 2 or type 3 process, because that is going to be a barrier to us, and it's going to affect our costs, and it's going to affect the viability of the development generally. So I think particularly when you're trying to build a housing at some of those price points, yeah, it's a big deal for developers. So I would just say yes, I agree.
Okay, so Terry, I see we have some time left here, and you have a slide about next steps. It might be good to go over those.
I do. I'll go ahead and share that. If I can find it. Okay, our next steps are to finish this meeting and follow up with a couple of questions that you all had tonight. Then we're preparing to go to the City Council for a work session on January 25th. And we're planning to include some of the presenters that you all have heard from tonight and back in December. So that'll be exciting. And then, as we talked about, we're going to return to you to do an in-depth work session on the rules and the model code. That's scheduled now for February 1st at 11:30. And then as far as the technical work, like Matt was saying, the code concepts have been started. They're going to be refined and broadly shared through an online survey and meetings in a box, and through other media that are outlined in the PI plan, the public involvement plan. As I said earlier, you all have many meetings to look forward to between now and the end of May, looking at drafts and code products that are coming out of the project team. Those products are due by the end of June. And then again, we have about a year, including resolving any local appeals, hopefully, to adopt a local code by June 30th, 2022. Those are our next steps.
Terrific. Mr. Taylor, I see your hand is up. I don't know if that's a
leftover.
Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. Any questions, thoughts from other commissioners? We have just some time left here now. Anything's occurred to you in the meantime you'd like to chime in? Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. LIE and Scott, I mean, Matt and Tyler also addressed it. I think one of our biggest challenges is really, and I love Eugene for this, and I also think it is often our biggest challenge. Like if you look at sustainability, we have these really lofty values and principles. And then when it comes to actually instituting them, they don't happen. And there's contradiction in our community. So the same community members that are saying, yeah, I want affordability, they're also there to say, well, but not in my neighborhood. So I really think that somehow, I mean, that is our biggest challenge is what does the rubber meet the road? How can we get some level of accountability? I think us being clever as a group in planning, like for instance, looking at land use applications, that involves a public process that could potentially obstruct development of affordable and middle housing. So what are the tools that we can use? And then obviously networking with other departments and other community members and organizations to help with this challenge. That's it.
Thank you.
That was well said. Could I give a quick shout out to the rest of my core team that's been patiently waiting? Feel free to turn on your cameras for a second, but kudos to Jeff and Lauren and Sophie and Jen for all of your work. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks. Okay, Alyssa, we have 3 minutes left here for items from staff or other things we should not forget before our next meeting, including our next meeting.
Great. I just have a couple of items, and then I don't know if any other commissioners have items or of interest. So your next meeting is on Monday, the 25th at 11:30, and that will be a continuation of your deliberations on clear and objective. I know Janessa is working on a couple of things for that. One is to continue working on the list of items to go through. And then also, I think her plan is to bring back some of the revised code language for some of the stuff we've already gone through, just to keep their project moving. And then the next evening, so on Tuesday, January 26th, you have a public hearing on 2 Metro Plan Amendment zone change applications. And just a reminder that those are quasi-judicial applications, not legislative. So if somebody starts lobbying you about those, you know what to do. And then finally, we'll be back again on February 1st for a deep dive. I feel like we can't have enough meetings on HB 2001. There's just so much to talk about, and it's a bit of a fire hose, but we'll be back to dive in deeper into what the rules say and the model code and how we move forward with that. Terry mentioned that the middle housing is going to City Council on the 25th. That would be an evening meeting, the 5:30 work session. And then we have another council meeting that week on Wednesday at the noon session. Late last year, council initiated a code amendment to address setbacks of buildings in commercial zones. And they asked us to check in after we got some feedback from some stakeholders. And so that's what that meeting is about on the 27th. At some point that will be coming to you, but that they've specifically asked that we return to them with this initial feedback. And then I wanted to address Carlene Riley's comments and Commissioner Isaacson's response to that. And thank you. I really appreciate that she brought that up. I know, we all read about the death on River Road and area, and I mean, it's heartbreaking. And Public Works Transportation Planning is actively working on safety improvements in that corridor. And I know that the Transportation Planning Manager, we had him reach out to you, Commissioner Isaacson, just to talk about what was going on and what can be done there. One planning, as I also heard, it's not just about the improvements, it's about how does that interact with land use applications and development review. One thing that's underway right now, one project that's related to that is an update of our code related to transportation demand management and the TIA, which I just forgot what the I stood for. Do you know what a TIA is? I think you all do. And that is a code update project being led by Public Works Transportation Impact. Thank you. Public Works Transportation Planning. Commissioner Edwards is letting me know what that is because she is actually our project resource for that. It's funny, I've gotten a little further away from the code and I kind of forget what some of it says. I don't have all 700 pages memorized anymore. So my apologies, but I think Commissioner Edwards is our resource on that and hopefully she'll have an update for us at some point. I don't know how the meetings, how they're working out in this environment. So, and I know that they at some point want to come to Planning Commission as well for a meeting. And so that will be a good place to weigh in for that. And that is all I have.
Well, terrific. I see no hands up, and I know if you're like me, you're eager to get on with your evening. So we will see you when we meet again. Thanks again for all your hard work and your attention. See you next time.